welcome. Today we are doing our talks in English. We are very proud and very happy to have today with us Professor Altman. Professor Altman, how are you? Ed, you are in New York today, right? You
Absolutely.
are close to New York.
It's a nice sunny day, but quite cool here.
Okay. So thank you, Ed. We appreciate your time. Really thanks. You know that we are doing these talks in our Center of European Law and Finance. I don't think I need to spend more words about Professor Altman. Professor Altman is Professor of Finance Emeritus at Stern in New York, the Business School of NYU, and Professor Altman created in 1967 probably the scoring model, one of the scoring model most used by the bank, called Z-score, and he is one of the most influential people in the world of finance. And he was director of the Journal of Banking and Finance. He's really a star in the credit market. And today we would like to talk about credit market conditions. So thank you, Ed. Ed was and used to be my professor, so I'm very proud to have Ed today with us. So Ed, we would like to talk about credit market conditions. And this is a 15 minutes conversation, very informal. First issue that we would like to raise with you is, what do you think about the credit market conditions before the pandemic, so before the COVID-19? And then happy to talk with you about the credit market condition and first reaction after the COVID-19, when the COVID-19 was a pandemic in March and April, and then happy to understand your sensitivity today and what is your focus for 2020 and 2021. But let's start with, what do you think that it was the credit market before the pandemic in 2019? What is your feeling in respect of the credit market?
Well, thank you very much, Patrizio, and thank you for the Center for having this informal interview. It's always a great pleasure to interact with my good friend Patrizio Messina from Italy. It's very important to understand what happened during COVID-19. But first, it's important to understand what was the conditions just before it started. Indeed, I was quite concerned about the credit markets in 2019, not because we were in a recession or a downturn, but because of the enormous buildup in debt in the global system, particularly in the corporate system. In the United States, for example, the amount of debt to GDP was at an all-time high. And every time we've had a peak in the corporate debt to GDP ratio, we've had a subsequent downturn, usually coincident with a recession, that caused a large number of defaults and bankruptcies and credit crisis. This happened in 1991, 01, 02, and 08, 09, the great financial crisis. Fast forward to what we were in 2019, we were at a new peak in this debt to GDP, not only in the United States, but globally. And the amount of debt in the system had grown dramatically in the last 20 years, from 1997, from 2007 into 2019. So we were vulnerable, regardless of what the catalyst was for a downturn. And we didn't know when the downturn would start. Fast forward to 2020 and COVID-19. As you said, the catalyst was, of course, the pandemic, which became quite apparent in the United States in February and March. And there was an immediate crisis situation. The benign credit cycle that we were in through 2019 changed dramatically, the quickest change anyone had ever experienced in the United States and in the world. We went from a benign to a stressed or distressed situation. The economy immediately went into recession globally, starting out in, of course, in China, and then spreading to Europe and the United States. The stock market and the bond markets fell dramatically in March. And it was very clear that if this continued, there would be enormous economic disruptions globally. And so, within a very short period of time, the central banks of the world, and particularly the Federal Reserve in Washington and the European Central Bank, instituted emergency, unprecedented actions to support the markets, lowering interest rates, providing liquidity, particularly dealing with such things as purchasing in the secondary market of corporate bonds, and even bonds of companies that had been downgraded from investment grade to non-investment grade. We call them fallen angels. Even those were supported, plus direct lending to medium-sized companies and an enormous expansion of the money supply. This was complemented by the US Congress passing a $3 trillion stimulus bill in April. The two together worked amazingly. And the stock market began to recover, the bond markets recovered, and this has continued to the present situation. What has not recovered is the real economy as much. We are still in a recession. Unemployment is still quite high. And we've had an enormous increase in bankruptcies and defaults. Let me say one more thing about what happened so far in 2020. While we had this pandemic, while we had this recession, we also had, and it has never happened.
Sorry, Adi, if I interrupt you. Do you think that this recession is fully connected with the pandemic? Because in your explanation, in 2019, it was something in relation to the recession, that it was independent about the pandemic, or the recession is completely connected with the pandemic? What do you think about it?
I think the recession is definitely related to the pandemic, the timing of the recession.
100%.
But a number of companies that have gone bankrupt and defaulted and had problems were the ones that had the most debt buildup prior to the pandemic, or they were in certain very sensitive industries like restaurants, retail, travel, communication. Now, a lot of these companies would have failed anyway, but it happened more quickly. And secondly, and this is the amazing thing, Patrizio, that we've never seen before. During a pandemic, during a recession, during a downturn, we had an enormous continued increase in issuance of new debt by companies, by the government. And usually what happens in a downturn is the markets get more risk averse. Just the opposite this time. It's become risk on. Investors globally are looking for higher yield with the low interest rates. And they were comforted by the Federal Reserve and the stimulus actions, giving them confidence to invest, even though they would suffer in the short run from the recession. We'd never seen this before. And just to give you an idea, the high yield junk bond market, which is about $2 trillion in the US, and in Europe about 550 billion euros, has had more issuance this year, more risky debt than any year ever in the history of our markets. So far, over $400 billion of junk bonds issued. The highest year before was 2012, when it was about 340 billion.
Because investors, they would like to have a yield?
Exactly. And they were confident that the government would come to support many of these companies.
Right.
So it's almost like, remember Super Mario in Europe saying those famous 20 words, we will do whatever's necessary to support the markets.
Whatever it takes.
Sorry?
Whatever it takes. This was very famous here. Whatever it takes.
And it was very similar to what happened in March and April. And I think the markets were looking beyond the pandemic, perhaps to a vaccine, but also to the eventual recovery of the real economy, and having a much longer term view for the growth and a shorter term view for the support of the government. And so they got confident, and I was surprised, to be honest with you. And
so you think that the responses of the governments, they were good enough for investors, for the market, for the credit market condition, and responses in US and responses here in Europe? Is this your feeling?
I think certainly in the US, I think the chairman of the Federal Reserve and other leading policymakers are overwhelmingly happy with the results. But here's my main concern, Patrizio. This has fostered a risk-on environment, enormous amount of debt issued on top of already, and that's why I wanted to start with a discussion of what was the case before COVID-19, on top of a very highly leveraged situation for the last 10 years. And so my concern is the concept of unintended consequences. They didn't intend that there would be this enormous amount of debt issuance. All they wanted to do was to stabilize the stock market and the bond markets. But what has happened is, not only has it stabilized enormously, I mean, the Standard & Poor index is up 12% from what it was at the beginning of the year. During a pandemic, during a recession, much more than anybody felt. And so I'm predicting, and maybe we can get to now the predictions for 2021. I'm predicting a short run reduction in bankruptcies and defaults. I would expect this year to end up about 6% default rate of high yield bonds. Historic average is about 3%. So about twice the historic average. I'm also quite confident that we will break all records for large bankruptcies in the United States. Interestingly, Patrizio, some countries of the world like Germany, and to some extent Italy and other European countries, have almost prohibited bankruptcies. They can't happen.
Right.
Or there's a moratorium on interest payments.
Yeah.
That has not happened.
This is what we have in Italy. We have a moratorium at the moment.
Exactly. So what this does is like kick the can down the road, because those companies eventually will have to pay their back interest plus the new interest that they'll have. And if your real economy stays in a recession, which I'm sure it will in Italy and many other European countries in 2021, then there's going to be a day of reckoning. And I think it's going to happen in the US too, probably in the second half of 2021. The first half, I think, will be, especially with the vaccine coming on board, I think will be a robust growth in the United States. Not as much as it would have been without the lockdowns, but our lockdowns are not nearly as effective as the European ones, I'm sorry to say.
Last question, Ed, and thank you. Your words very clear, and the message is very clear. So what do you think about the corporate default in corporate bond? Do you think it's different? Your perception is different, corporate default and corporate default in corporate bond? Or do you think that your feeling is basically the same? What is your perception in relation to 2020 and in relation to 2021?
Yeah, I think the default rate among companies that issue bonds is lower than I thought it would be, about 6%. And in the beginning of the year, I thought it would be 8 or 9% back in March and April. And that's partially because of the government support, that it's not as bad. But the number of billion-dollar bankruptcies already this year through the end of November has been 58 billion-dollar companies have gone bankrupt. The prior most year ever was 2009, when it was 49. We've already broken that record. And that's partially because of oil and gas industry, but it's also the pandemic. And so, but a lot of that has happened because of the vulnerability of companies prior to the COVID-19. For 2021, I think the default rate will stay high, maybe even higher than 2020, particularly in the second half, because of this enormous debt buildup. For good companies, there's not a problem, but the zombie companies, the ones that have not been able to cover their interest in their past, that's going to really kick in, I think, in the second half of the year. So I'm going to be watching these very closely. And let me say one final thing, because I know we're about out of time. And maybe we can cover this in a second interview.
Yes.
And that is, what does the Z-score say about COVID-19 and the future? And let me tee up what could be the discussion next time, as well as discussing the Z-score model in more detail and its history and why it's still around after more than 50 years. Now, let me just say this. There's one sector of the US investment grade bonds and loans that is particularly vulnerable to downgrades, and that's triple Bs, BBB. That's the lowest of the investment grade. Next time, perhaps we can cover what the Z-score was saying about this sector before COVID-19 and what has happened during COVID-19 to the downgrades, what we call fallen angels. So let me tee that up for another discussion with you next time.
And super thanks first for your time today, and super thanks in advance for our next talks when we are going to talk about COVID-19 and Z-score. So thank you, Ed. It was really great to have you here, and thank you. Talk with you soon.
My pleasure. Good luck.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.